Welcome back to C# application development. So this is going to start sort of module 6 proper. So what we're going to talk about is how do you incorporate server-side web API code into the SPA that we've been talking about kind of all along. And so if you want to use a WPF application to talk to the services, you can certainly do that. I'm going to do a separate video about how you can kind of stand those up side by side. But this primary kind of track through the content is going to be about the SPA, because I think that's a little bit more applicable in terms of the job opportunities you might see. So I'm going to basically start this off by saying you could absolutely create a blank project, and you could create a web API template solution to do all the server-side code. What we're trying to do, though, is we're trying to put the server-side code into the same solution that we're already running on or running with the SPA, so that we only have one browser window that kind of supports both the UI and the server-side code. So how we're going to do that is you can take a new project. You can go down and select Web API instead of empty in a .NET Framework web application, and you can hit create, and then you can copy all of the files that you don't see in the SPA from the new template that you just created. What I'm going to do really quick, though, is I'm going to go through kind of the high points of what some of those files are and what they do, so that you don't kind of get lost in the weeds. So if you create a new solution, you're going to notice several different things. First of all, there are going to be a ton of packages in NuGet that you're not going to have seen before. The high points are Bootstrap and jQuery. These things get created because typically you are using an SPA front end. We didn't necessarily use either of these technologies for the SPA that we talked about last week. These just kind of make your life a little bit easier. Bootstrap is the kind of widely used CSS library that helps you resize things fluidly. So if you have a responsive web app that you want to put on a mobile device, or if you want to put it on an iPad and you want the full desktop experience at the same time, Bootstrap helps you make sure that it is responsive to screen size. So this automatically gets downloaded with that template. jQuery also helps you traverse the DOM, so jQuery can help you do automatic updates to UI and stuff like that. This has a whole bunch of stuff in it that also gets downloaded. You'll also get ASP.NET.MVC. So this stuff has a lot of runtime assemblies that get used in the startup, and we'll talk about that in just a second. And you'll also get Web API Core and Web API Client. These are the two primary pieces of code that do all of the sort of nice to have features for Web API, which we're going to talk about kind of extensively in just a minute. In addition to that, you also get here web pages. You also get web infrastructure and modernizer. So web infrastructure is really for kind of hosting stuff. Modernizer is an interesting one, and you might see this a lot, or something like it a lot in industry. What this does is it offers legacy support for new SPAs that you're trying to render on really old browsers. So what you'll find if you go into any kind of enterprise situation is many companies run in enterprise mode, IE or something like that. All of their users will be very used to an older browser, and they will want to keep that older browser if for no other reason than people like it, but potentially also they have web applications that require legacy support. If you're trying to give that client a brand new shiny SPA, they don't necessarily want to migrate away from that old browser, something like Modernizer can help you. It will allow you to have access to things that you wouldn't necessarily have access to in those old browsers, and it will also make sure that your site will actually render. So this is kind of a nice one, and this actually comes with that template in Visual Studio 2019. So the long and short of it is everything in an empty sort of web solution for Visual Studio is a bunch of files, and those files typically have some naming conventions around them. And a lot of it is going to seem completely witchcraft. There's not a lot of well-documented science, or that I've at least found, around a lot of it. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to start at the top and kind of work through the high-level stuff, particularly focusing on the Web API components and what the registration of Web API means. And then we're going to look really quickly at a get method on a Web API controller that allows us to replace some of the hard-coded stuff that we did in the JavaScript SPA last week. So to start that off, global.asax. So if you have copied a bunch of files over to your SPA project, global ASAX is definitely the weirdest one, and I say that because it has many files underneath it, and this thing is actually a special file that is essentially the entry point to an CIS project in Visual Studio. So once Visual Studio runs CIS, it will look and it will say, oh, there's a global application page associated with this, this site, and it will actually go here instead of to your index.html, and it will start doing all of the stuff that you tell it to do inside of application start. So this is a part of ASP.NET MVC. And so there are tons of events and stuff in here that happen throughout the lifecycle of the app, like starting a session and all this stuff. We're only going to use this application start, and what we're essentially doing is we're using MVC as a kind of shell or a container that's going to run a registered API. So we're not going to use a lot of this other stuff. Some of this stuff is stateful or stateful implementations. We don't actually care about any of that. So if you wanted to, you could just delete this entirely and only really work with that one method. So how did I know all of these other things existed? Well, if you copied the file over from the template, that's one thing that would just exist. But also, if you right-click on the project, you go to Add New Item. If you do not yet have a global ASAX page or file in your site, if you go to C# Web General, global application will be at the very top, and it has to be named global, and you have to add it in order for it to actually work. So if you change this global name, IS won't know where to go and find it. This is essentially a main method kind of thing. So if you look in the application start, there is a bunch of stuff that comes kind of out of the box in the template. So if you add a new blank global file, clearly none of this stuff is going to be here. All you're going to have is empty methods. This stuff comes directly from the template. So the template kind of boilerplate code gives you this stuff, which largely puts together the RESTful API framework that you need in order to stand up your API. So a lot of this stuff is maybe less than helpful. The biggest thing that you need to do is make sure that you have all of these files under app_start copied from the template over to your solution, or you have downloaded this solution, which I'll upload to Canvas, and you can use just this solution as your starting point. To wrap it all up though, or at least wrap this part of the conversation up, I want to go to Web API really quick and talk about this register method. So the way that Web API works is it's going to be based on a controller framework that is kind of behavior that exists that implements your RESTful service. And so we previously talked about how the goal of all of this is to decentralize code as much as possible. And so we're going from models in the database up to service layer architecture, and then from the server to the client side, where we're going to have maybe DTOs or something that are actually bound to the UI. These controllers are actually the stateless behavior of your system. And so we're going to talk about many of these things. But what we have here is a semester controller, and so if you think of all the kind of activities that a semester could be associated with, particularly CRUD operations for that entity, all that stuff would be housed inside of the controller class, and we'll take a look at that in just a second. The point here, though, is this route template, after you have registered everything, is telling the underlying code how to get to this semester controller from just the global kind of root level access to your site. So if we run this thing up, what's going to end up happening is we're going to have a little bit of time, and there's nothing in the root application. What we actually need is API so what this is telling me is I have to go to API, then I have to go to the name of my controller, then I have to go to whatever the method name is effectively. And so here, what I'm able to do is I'm able to go to API/semester/get, and I'm able to get XML, in this case, that mimics exactly what you would see in GitHub, at the GitHub API, if you watched the previous video. So this is basically, again, just a raw feed of data, and what we're going to end up doing is we're going to use our Angular page to pull this data across and serve this data with C#. So that's what this looks like, and that's what this registration method is doing. It's actually telling us the sort of default format, what needs to go into the address to get from that root that didn't have anything, so I don't know where I am, to the actual web endpoint. And so this endpoint is going to give us the semesters that are in my fake database at this point. I could have a create that takes in some data and puts it into the database, so on and so forth. So this is being served by the controller. So if you take a look over here, we can go into the actual controller code. So I want to take just a second to talk about the fact that we're using the word controller twice. So in one sense, we have a controller that is bound to the view. So this controller right here is a client-side controller. So this is the C part of MVC. This is actually giving us direct access to data on the client side, and then it is manipulating the view that is represented by index.html. This controller is server side. So this C# code does not run on the client machine. In my case it is, because my machine is both the web server and it is the client machine. But in a standard sort of distributed environment, a person could go, instead of to the default local host on this port /API/semester/get to my hosted web address, domain name, whatever, /API/semester/get, and get this data without ever having this data on their machine beforehand. So this is now all server-side code. So the two primary components of this that are a little bit different from the things that you've seen before. First, we have that we have these decorators. What these decorators are doing is they are giving us the route that we can use to override what that default route is for registration. So here, what I'm saying is, if I go literally to API/semester, I'm going to get to this class implementation in my web API. If I use /get, I'm going to go to this method in my web API implementation. So this get could be named starfish, whatever, as long as this route matches the end of the URL, everything's great. Everything kind of works, everybody's happy. When a user goes to this URL, ends with get, it maps to this, this method. And the other part that is kind of weird is instead of returning kind of normal, what I consider a normal value, we're actually returning a task. So it is an asynchronous task that is this weird interface, HTTP action result. What is happening here is we can take any object we want and we can wrap that in a web response code, essentially. And so here we have an OK. So what's going to happen is the result of my call, so the response that the JavaScript is going to get, is going to be wrapped in a 200 HTTP response, and it is going to contain this data in its response. And so last time we talked about how you could have response.data would just be the 100 repositories or whatever that GitHub was giving us back. In this case, we're getting back a list of semesters that lives on my mock database class. And so if I go to my database class really quick, literally this is just a static class. I have a static list of semesters, and if you look, this list of semesters is based on a set of statically typed classes here, and so I have 3 of them. If you look in the app.js file, that mimics exactly what we had last Thursday. So last Thursday we were talking about basically presenting a list of semesters to the end user, just hard coding it in JavaScript. Now, instead of hard coding it in JavaScript, what I've done is I've created a dummy database mock class. That database mock class has partial classes that are surfaced through a static list. I am contacting a controller, and that controller is returning to me the entire list of semesters. So if I go back to my application, and instead of going to /API/semester/get, I go to index.html. Now I see fall 2019, spring 2020, and summer 2020, even though in my app.js I have commented out the line that creates the semesters. And the reason is that now, when I refresh this thing, I'm actually going off to my server-side code, to the semester controller at API/semester/get, and I am receiving the response that is wrapped in my 200 status code, and the data contains those 3 objects that I put in the hard-coded list. And the point of this exercise is that I didn't have to do anything in order to convert those statically typed classes into JSON in the response. So that mapping was done entirely for me using the web API libraries. And so now it's very, very easy for me to go from a statically typed thing on the server to an untyped thing in JavaScript on the client. No mapping had to happen, and I have no additional code here to do anything. I don't have AutoMapper, I have nothing. And when I hit continue, this line of code functions exactly as if I just created a hard-coded list in JavaScript. So we talked a little bit last week about how client-side development is not the strength of C#. Really, the strength of C# it happens on the server side, and this is one of the big reasons why I say that. You don't have to do a lot of heavy lifting in order to translate from this statically typed or strongly typed DB mock class into something that can easily be rendered in an SPA. So all I did again, was use the HTTP service to go off. This time, instead of to GitHub, I went to my web API that I put together in maybe 5 minutes. And I know this is the address that I want because it is implemented in the decorators for this controller class. So things that are required to make that work. You have to have the global ASACs because you have to have a application start method. That application start method has to perform all of this registration. All of that registration is ultimately going to call this web API config. That web API config here is being passed in. This is a method group, which we'll talk about a little bit later in the semester. But once that happens, we get the web API starts asking or responding to requests, and then we can override the address that it's responding on using these decorators. The only other piece of that puzzle is we talked last time about the difference between post and get and delete requests, and we know that this thing is an HTTP get API call because here is decorated with HTTP get. So if you had an HTTP post request, that post request would also expose an HTTP body that would allow you to encode data to be sent over to the server without using the URL API, which is the next thing we're going to talk about. That is kind of where we're going, but suffice it to say, when you call your method here, get, has to match the method that is stamped on the controller. So here I have an HTTP get, and in the JavaScript I have a get method. So that kind of wraps it up for this sort of introduction to what the heck is Web API and how does it hang together. If you got lost at the beginning on the file stuff, not so necessary because you can use this this solution as a template, but it is very, very important that you understand that this piece of code, this HTTP call, is able to call out to this controller because of this prefix line and this route right here. We're going to make heavy use of these two things, not only this module, but in the next module as well. So thanks for tuning in, and next time we're going to talk a little bit about the URL API. Thanks.